Okay, so there's the bell. We're going to get started. If you don't mind leading us in a prayer, thank you.
Dear Father, we thank you for this morning that we have to gather together. We thank you for the specific time that we can learn more about how you inspired your word into this book and how it's influenced everyone and how it will continue to influence everyone and give us the guide map, how we can better live, to be a better example to others so they can see how great you are. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay, so I'm not Curtis. I'm Sean Quinn. Most of y'all know me, don't have maybe some visitors. I always joke that I work with the most judgmental human beings on the planet. I teach 7th grade history over Bowling Green Junior High School, but it is still infinitely more intimidating to get up in front of you guys. So as we go through this, I love questions. I like the back and forth of it. I like the discussion. So feel free, if you have a question, ask it. I do not have Curtis's encyclopedic knowledge of anything related to anything in the past, so I will answer it, but one of the big things is I may say, hey, you know what? I need to either look that up and get back with you, or we're going to see if anybody else has answers, because I'm sure we have a plethora of people who are more knowledgeable about this stuff. And so don't be afraid to ask questions. If you do, we got somebody with a mic in the back. That way, because they're being recorded, you can listen to them. Raise your hand or just call out and I'll get them to come over to see you. And ask those questions. That's great. A lot of this stuff is history. That's what I teach. This is the part of history that I love. We're moving into the Middle Ages. That's actually the content that I teach to my 7th graders now, and what I taught when I taught high school. So I really like this stuff, and it is interesting as we go through it. Like you said in our prayer, this is really about how we got the things we've got. And it really is interesting to see the steps that it takes. And to me, it's a real faith builder to see, you know what, we went from this to this to this, to see that pathway. Because a lot of times you're just like, oh, we got a Bible. I was joking with Stephen when I first started teaching the class. I said, it's going to be a real short class. How we got the Bible? We drove to the mall, went to Lifeway, bought it, and walked home. Class over. There we go. But, or in my case, you download it on your phone. Done, okay? There we go. We got our Bible. And so actually seeing these steps and being reminded that, you know, there is a plan. God's providence has a purpose in all of this. Is really good. And one thing, I don't think Curtis has brought this up. This whole thing, this PowerPoint is from a guy named Timothy Paul Jones, PhD. He actually teaches at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary up in Louisville. But his book's pretty good. And this is sort of the book we're working out of. And it has a lot more. It is not ordered how we're doing it, but it's it gets a lot deeper into some of the things that we're talking about. We've got 4 or 5 pages just on the codexes we're going to talk about this morning. So, like I said, any questions? I like questions. It's really weird to hear myself behind me, too, so I'm going to be turning around a lot. I've added a bunch to the PowerPoints. I did go through and upsize them for everybody. I know some people said they couldn't see them so well. And I'm going to look at a way maybe to get them, I meant to talk to Jason about trying to get it online so you can sort of see them maybe a little closer, if we can maybe host it on the website. But I tried to upsize it as best I could, and I'm trying to keep up with Curtis as we go. So where we ended, we started talking about the papyrus. And if you've ever made papyrus, you ever got grandkids or kids and you want to do this, there's actually, you can go to Google and say how to make papyrus, and it's a really cool craft activity. I do it with my students. We make it with construction paper, because it's sort of that same grainy feel as the papyrus. And you layer it, and then you layer it, and it cross-hatches it, and you lay it out, and when it comes out, you cover it in glue, which is what they would have done, not Elmer's, because they didn't have that in Egypt. But they would have covered it with some kind of adhesive, animal fat, things like that, squished it, and when it comes out, it is paper, and they can write on it. And so that's really neat. This is the Ryland fragment that he was talking about. It's got a lot of, that's just that little part. I believe that was part of Matthew, and so that would work really well. Oh, sorry, it's John 18. So it's from AD 90 to 150. So that is if it was in 90, it's easily a first-hand account of exactly what it would have been. So it's pretty interesting. And you can go see these if you ever are in Europe. They're in a museum in Germany, I believe. I couldn't remember. I looked for more specifics, but I couldn't get that. School, my clicker doesn't work, so I just tell a kid to click for me. So I got to get used to that one. Okay, so we talked about the codexes, right? And so these codexes, it's a bound volume. It is going to be, they're going to take their papers, they're going to take this, either vellum or parchment, which are a little different, and we're going to talk about what the differences are, those here in a minute, and they would fold them together. And you can still make codexes. They would fold it and then ram a needle through it with leather and then bind it all together. And so what they would do is they shifted from the scrolls, because we talked about those scrolls, right? So they have the scroll, and they're written up and down, and they would roll it, and the scroll is only written on the inside. Remember Curtis talked about the one, it's the Isaiah scroll that's on display, and it stretches from one side of the room to the other, and they've replaced it, and they only show a part of it at a time to preserve it. So the question that I've thought of is why? Why do you think people are going to shift from the scrolls to binding these books instead? And it's sort of just a little thought exercise and I just asked Davis, and I said, Davis, why do you think they're going to go to books instead of scrolls? And he goes, they're easier. Yeah, they are. And that's really, when you look historically, it is easier to get the books bound together, and they stay better. Plus, instead of only being able to write on the inside of that scroll, you're going to be able to write on the whole side of it. And so these codexes they're going to shift to those in the early 100s. Okay, we don't know for sure. We have some older codexes. We have some newer codexes. You can actually go to the mall or go to Barnes & Noble and buy books that are bound just like a codex would be. And you're going to see this. And one of the interesting things, just came up, that the British Museum bought the Codex Zacinthius, and it is a 7th century codex, and it covers Luke 1:11 to Luke 11:13. And what's interesting about this, it doesn't have that anymore. And so what it does have is a book of chunks of the Bible that was written in the 13th century. So what happened is, in the 7th century, they originally wrote Luke in this book. And then in the 13th century, books are expensive, like really expensive. And so a Bible then, you're looking 6 months to a year to working to do that. And if you're having to feed yourself, you're not going to be able to afford that. And so what they would do is they would take the older books, scrape off what was on there, and then write new stuff in it. And so what happened is this book has been in the British Library for 2-3 years, and they purchased it. So they could actually do more scientific study on it. They can shoot an electron microscope at it, and they can see where the ink is. And they realize that it's what Curtis called a palimpsest, where there is a hidden text, not intentionally hidden, but there's a hidden text underneath that is actually the text more. And you can shoot an electron microscope at it, and you can see where the old ink is, and you can sort of make out those things. So if you're a big science geek, you can totally look at that. And actually, I did find some images. It wasn't clear enough to pop up here, where you can see the text, and then the other text underneath it, sort of underlaid it to sort of see where it is. And it's the entirety of Luke 1 and then 11 through 33 from the 7th century, that's a pretty big deal. That's pretty close. I also saw Curtis had talked about, see if y'all remember, what is the second most recorded book in mankind's history? The Iliad and the Odyssey, right? By our buddy Homer. And it was passed down for 100 years, or for hundreds of years in oral tradition. It was just last year they found the oldest copy of it that was from, they believe, 400 years after he spoke it, or after he had originally sort of laid it out. And one of the reasons that we don't have any copies of that is the Greeks in the early Greeks, were not very fond of parchment and vellum and all the stuff that we're going to talk about. Anybody know what they used instead? Same thing that the Babylonians would have used. What's that? Clay tablets. Okay, and one thing, anybody ever had their kid bring home a clay tablet from school? Like, I want to keep this, it's going to live forever, and then it dies within a week? Yeah, because clay, it dries out over time, and it just sort of shatters. We have records from the Babylonians. It's called the Nebuchadnezzar cylinder, and it's still remarkably intact, but it's one of the only one of the, like 10 that we have. And so clay is not very good. So what happened is they found this in Olympia in Greece, outside of the temple of Zeus. And so it's just it's 14 lines of this poem. and it's from 400 years later. So it's pretty interesting. And that was just last year that they found this. Yeah, I got the clicker. I got to get used to that. That's what I was talking about with the leather. That's how they would bind it. That's a more modern one. It was just the best picture I could get. But they would put use wood, or they would use some kind of hard binding, if you look up front to see that. And then they would bind it together with the leather, and those are folded pages. If you've ever had a book fall apart, we still make our books remarkably like this now. A hardbound book, it usually has the string going through it, and it also has the glue on the spine. The only difference is they wouldn't have the glue on the spine. And there are some really intricate ones. The more expensive, the more you pay for it, the more hand-worked it's going to be. Wrapped in leather. Leather as a cover is another thing that they would do. That's the codex. That's just another example of a codex. Just to show you, it's what when you imagine an old book, that's sort of what you think back to. So that's just an example. I want to show you also a little more imagery. And then that is the Codex, I can't say it right, Zethinius, that is, that they just purchased and they're starting to do some research on at the British Museum, or the British Library. And you can see, as you look at it, if you look over to the bottom right, or the top left up there, you can sort of see where people have made notes over time, which is sort of interesting because that's, when we look at this, we've talked about, ultimately what we're doing is called critical research, right? We are being critical of the sources. And you can sort of see the notes, and you can see the ideas of the original writers and all this stuff, and as you go through this. And I mean, they're not going to let anybody just walk in and take a look at this, but they usually have it on display. And several of these have actually been cut up over time. So here we go. This is the technical part of it. We're going to get into what is the difference between parchment and vellum, okay? Because in about 300 to 1400, that's going to be your writing stuff, okay? Parchment is scraped and stretched skins, usually from calves, sheep, or goats, okay? So parchment is any kind of skin. Have you ever seen that? You work it really, you work the fat and all the gristle off of it, and you stretch it so thin, and then you cut it into pieces, and it is remarkably good. We have copies of parchment that are thousands of years old, from the 300s, that we know, and you can still read it. The ink is still there. It just does a really good job of bonding, and it's really great. If you've ever written on real parchment, it's really neat to write on because it just sort of flows. It's not like paper, nothing scratches. Stephen and I are big pen guys, and he's more than me, but when you write on something, it's neat. But parchment is really cool. And you can get parchment now that is more of a, if you've ever done calligraphy, it's called parchment, but it's really just fancy paper. And then vellum is higher quality, okay? What does that word sound like, vellum? Who said? Velour, okay, fancy, yeah. This is something I do with my students a bunch, is you take a word apart to sort of see where you think. Anybody had Italian lately? A really good Italian restaurant is going to serve you good what? Veal. Vellum comes from the word veal. The original French, and veal and vellum are pretty much interchangeable. And so vellum could be considered parchment, except that vellum has to be from a calf, okay? And it is worked and worked and worked, and then you rub pumice. Anybody ever work real hard and get stuff on your hands? What do you use? Keith's nodding. You get pumice. You get this orange powder. It's got pumice in it, and it scrapes your hands clean, and they're really soft, right? And so what you would do is, after you would do your parchment preparation, you would get pumice, and you'd cover the whole thing in pumice, and you would rub it and rub it and rub it and rub it until it is perfectly fine, okay? And then you also get chalk. They would use chalk and treat it even more, so it's cleaner, it's a little whiter, it's a little smoother to write on. It's still just as good as the parchment. But the vellum, you ever heard somebody say, well, if they'll say things about like cheeses, well, if it's not real cheddar unless it comes from the cheddar region, blah, 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 or whatever. Vellum, it's not really vellum unless it comes from a calf. And I went to Amazon, I thought, you know what, maybe I'll look to see how much it is just to buy a piece of vellum. And Amazon won't sell the calf kind, they only sell vellum, That is like a paper that you can get. When you do like wedding invitations and stuff, that's vellum paper, but it's not really. It's not really that. So any questions on that? That's pretty straightforward. There actually is an interesting story about why. So why did they go from papyrus? Because it was working okay for them. They hadn't seen that it's going to waste. What people believe, and we have a record of a royal court that does this. You've got a guy named King Eumenes of Pergamum. We've heard of Pergamum before. What happens is the Egyptians and this king are having sort of a fight, right? And remember, where does papyrus come from? Egypt, right? It grows right there. So you've got the Egyptians and you got King Eumenes, and he's part of government. And this is, sorry, I'm going to go back to my civics for a second. What lets a government run effectively in the ancient times is record keeping. You don't get large governments until you get the ability to record everything. And most of it is economic stuff. You know what? I traded Gary 16 bushels of corn. He's going to give me, well, they wouldn't have corn, but he's going to give me 3 cows, and we're going to contract that, and we're going to have it there. Or taxes, okay? Kelly's a tax collector. He's going to come and say, you know what? I collected from Sean Quinn 16 chickens. And that's going to keep a record, and we're going to be able to get this. And that is remarkably good for us historians, because that's ultimately what we are in this class right now, because we get to see day-to-day life. Okay, 16 chickens was relatively equivalent to taxes for a month, which we know Gary had taxes of a horse. So that's about 16 chickens to a horse, maybe, okay. And you can figure that out. And so this guy, King Eumenes, he's not able to record all of this stuff. And so he puts out this decree, figure out a better way to write things. And the legend is, we don't know this is the traditional story, is that the guy, one of his butchers, one of the guys who works in his butcher shops, comes in and says, hey, write on this. And it's the skin of a calf or a cow. And they say, hey, this works. And so he's sort of to the Egyptians and says, you know what? We don't need you. We're going to do this. And then that's sort of like, as I was reading it, I sort of started thinking like the cell phone revolution. Like, we went from all having a house phone. No, but some of us have house phones, most of us have cell phones. So it's slowly, this is sort of the Apple. He was the Steve Jobs of his day. He comes up with the vellum. Well, he didn't, but he, of course, took credit. And he comes up with this new thing that is pretty much going to lay out the whole thing. Because who invents real paper? Anybody know? The original inventor of paper is the Chinese. The Chinese are going to invent what we use as paper, where you use the pulp and you bring the little mesh up out of the paper and it sort of sits there. The Chinese are going to have the original invention of paper. But for, 1,400 years, or from 300 to 1,400, so 1,100 years, they're going to use this vellum and parchment. That is the writing stuff, okay? So if you think, we got to thank the Chinese for that, because we're getting into school supplies. And think about if you had to go buy parchment for your people, and it was the original made from cows and stuff. That'd be really expensive. So, make sure I don't got no pictures. Okay, so vellum is going to be the go-to, because it is the high class, it is the high quality, it is worked more. The more organic material you get off of that, which is the pumice and the chalk is going to do, the vellum is going to last longer. And they start to figure that out pretty quick. Okay, and so vellum is going to be used for 2 big things. We're going to talk about this quite a bit. The first one is the Codex Vaticanus. Anybody want to take a guess where the Codex Vaticanus lives? Rome, in the Vatican, yeah. It's called the Codex Vaticanus because it's in the Vatican Library. Interesting thing, I had a buddy who's a history professor. You can go to the Vatican Library and look through all of their stuff. It's generally open. But he said it's really neat, because if you make an appointment and you go, they assign you a priest who is sort of like a hold, like I can't think of the word, sort of like a docent like we would have in a museum, but he's pretty much it. And you can't touch it, but he can. Certain books they'll let you, but if it's the older stuff, he'll get the white gloves out and you're like, okay, turn the page, and he turns the page for you. Or he said once he actually used this little spatula thing because it was an older book, and he turns it real slowly. He said it's really neat because you get all of this history. Now, a lot of that is their Catholic traditional stuff, but they're not going to let you get this book out. But it is on display. You can go see this. That is something I do want to say. A lot of this stuff, thanks to the internet, the Codex Vaticanus, you can go And if you just Google it, one of the first 3 links is a digitized copy of it. And so you can click and it'll say, this is Matthew, from Matthew chapter 1 to Matthew chapter 2 is this. And you click on it and it pops up and it is the actual scanned copy of it, and you can sort of see where it goes from this. So the Vaticanus is going to be written in what language, probably? If it's written in the early 300s, or completed in the early 300s. What is the lingua franca? Latin. Not Latin yet, still Greek. Yeah, still Greek. Latin is going to take over a little later, but Greek is going to be where we're at with this one. Good guess, though. That would have been my first guess because, the Romans are in charge then. And we're pretty sure, we don't know where it came from. We don't know who the original, who the copier of it was, the scribe. And usually you can do that with all these books. You can sort of see the flourishes and the different changes. They're pretty sure it's more than 3 or 4 authors, but we don't know the path it took. But we do know it is the earliest copy of the New Testament. Now, notice I did not say complete copy of the New Testament. It is the earliest copy that we have that is mostly complete, okay? Because here's something we've got to remember. As we write things down, one of the big criticisms that you'll see if you ever start looking at this stuff is, for instance, it doesn't, one of the Gospels in one of these doesn't have the resurrection, right? But the basic argument is, okay, you just wrote the resurrection story in Matthew, and Mark is pretty much just an abridgment of Matthew, so why are you going to write pretty much exactly the same thing again? And so that's where you'll get that. And I understand that. I mean, when you look at how long it takes to copy these, so like for instance, the Vaticanus, I'm pretty sure, is the one that doesn't include the resurrection story in one of the Gospels. But it's in all the other 3. So I think it's more of a cost-saving, time-saving measure. But it was copied in the early 300s. That puts it 200 years away from the original, right? That's pretty good. And not just 200 years away from the original, but it's also 200 years away. That's not very far from here. Has anybody been to seen the Constitution? How old is the Constitution right now? 240-something years old, yeah. And it was well protected. It is well protected now, but before then, it was not well protected. It was kept just rolled up in a tube at one point in the basement of one of the buildings, and then they bring it out to show it off, and they put it back in. But now, it's pretty amazing if you ever get a chance. It's neat. But that's 240 years old, and it's readable. So I'm saying they're looking at originals, okay? Originals written by the eyewitnesses, okay? So I've got pictures of both here in a second. But the second one we got is the Codex Sinaiticus, okay? There's a clue to where it's from. Anybody know where it's from? Sinai. Where does it live, though? Anybody know? What did you say, Ty? In the mountains, yeah, because it is, the Sinaiticus means literally Book of Sinai, which is Book of the Mountains. It was originally found in St. Catherine's Monastery, which is one of the old, like if you've ever looked up ancient monastery, it looks like what you would think it would be. It's an old stone building in the Sinai Peninsula. Oddly enough, it was left alone when the Muslims rise to power, when Islam starts to spread. It is one of the places that, as they start to take over and do their thing, they leave it alone. They traditionally, what St. Catherine says, what the St. Catherine's Monastery monks will say is that Muhammad spent some time there researching and learning, and then that's why when they came back through, he sort of left it alone, which is sort of interesting. I mean, there's historical evidence both ways that it either happened or it didn't, but it's there, and that's where they started finding it. It actually has a really interesting story. The majority of it, because it's been split up a few times, the majority of the Codex Sinaiticus is in the British Library and has been since 1937. In 1937, you have Lenin in charge of the Soviet Union, and they're looking to raise money because they're trying to push more of their reorganization and all this stuff. And so Lenin arranges to sell the Codex Sinaiticus, which is in the St. Petersburg Museum, to the British. And so the British buy it for 1.1 million pounds at that time, which was, I think, 10 to 15 million pounds now. But they buy it and they put it on display. And it's actually sort of interesting. You would think this huge historical reference is going to be really well protected. I'll show you a picture of how they display it here in a second. But this is the earliest complete manuscript we have of the New Testament. Okay? So it was completed in the mid-300s, so it's only 40, 50 years older than the Vaticanus, but it is complete. It is everything that is in our modern Bible is there. Okay? And so it's pretty interesting. And just like the Vaticanus, you can go in and you can see scanned copies, and you can say, you know what, I want to see Matthew chapter 2. And there it is in the Greek. And so you can do all this stuff. It's pretty neat. You can do some things there if you speak Greek. Most of us don't. I don't think anybody here speaks Greek except Curtis, maybe. Nope. Okay. So it's in the British Library. You can go see it. This is the Vaticanus. You can see it's yellowed. This is the best picture I got. Everything looks a little yellow. We're up here. But you can see where it is recorded on both sides. You can see where the text sort of blends through there on the bottom of the first column. And then where it has been sort of the notes that people have taken on it over time. Okay? My kids always write stuff in their books, and I don't really care, whatever, they're all falling apart anyways. But I always think, man, what would it be like to be the guy who wrote on the Codex Vaticanus? To know that, that's not right. Or what if you make a spelling mistake? That'd be sort of bad. It also has illustrations. Very few, but it has some. Because if you're copying this thing by hand, and you have to stop and let someone else do this, and you can't really see it up there, but it says this is Simon, and I tried to look to see what verses this actually is, but I couldn't. I ran out of time. But this is Simon, and he's talking to a few guys. But it's pretty interesting that they actually took the time to illustrate as well, that tells us a little bit about their sort of mindset and what they thought was important. There it is, just spread open. That's the Vaticanus spread open. And just shows you 4 columns per page, and it's about this thick. So it is pretty well protected now. I looked for how they store it, but they don't, for security purposes, I guess. They don't want to tell people that. But it's got some neat, it's pretty interesting to see this is what you had in the 300s. Okay, so any questions about that? Actually, I'm sorry, that last one was, that was the Sinaiticus, not the Vaticanus, sorry. Any questions about that? And so that's what you have. And one thing we're going to talk about quite a bit when we get to the timeline portion of the class, which is next. Hold on one second, Gary, I'll get it to you. Let's just do this. Raise your hand if you can read. Everybody can read in this class, right? We have a literacy rate, which a literacy rate is described as the people who want to be able to read, who can read. And our literacy rate in the United States is 99.7%, okay? And that 0.3% is actually the kid, you measure kids. And so that is our literacy rate, right? What's the literacy rate in, let's just say in Roman times, 400, right before Rome collapses in 336? 1%. What's that? 1%. We think maybe in Rome it's a little higher at 6, possibly 6, because public schools are a recent invention, right? We have the Industrial Revolution, kids need somewhere to go so parents can work, and they pass these pesky child labor laws so they can't work. So we need somewhere for kids to go, and we need to make kids smarter so they can work better in these factories when they get out, right? So what do? We invent public schools, and I'm happy because it pays my bills. Back then, you didn't have that. You would go to work, and your kids would go with you. First century, same way. You would go to work, your kids go with you. Everybody had to work because if you didn't make enough food, what happened? You starve to death, right? And so everybody has to work. You don't have time to be sending kids to school to do no book learning when you've got to get the crop in, else you're not going to have dinner, right? And so in Rome, maybe 6%, if you're wealthy, you are higher. The priest class of their pagan religion would have been almost at 100% literacy rate because they're the ones that read. And we're going to see that trend continue up until we get roughly to the 1800s, but then literacy rate's going to skyrocket at about 1850s. That's when it's going to really go up and you're going to get schools, okay? But then, so this is what you have. And what Curtis was saying about, you know what, if you want a book, if you want a Bible, if we were a congregation way back in the day, let's just say even back with the Wycliffe Bibles, we would pool our money together to buy a Bible. And it may be a good copy, and it may be just the fastest thing that they could get out. But then the question my students always ask is, why wouldn't they just copy it? Why wouldn't they just copy it once they get it? They can't read and they can't write. And so they would be lucky to have the readers and the writers of the time are going to be your scribes, which are going to be trained by the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. Okay? And you may find a noble or their kids who could read and write, but most of the time you couldn't. And so that's one thing I really want you all to take away from what we've talked about, this history stuff, is we are spoiled by the fact that, if somebody came from the 1200s and said, oh, you have a Bible, we'd all hold their Bibles up and be like, yeah, it's even right here. And they would all be ridiculously impressed because they didn't, okay? They'd have one. And that's a whole nother series of classes of how do we get so far from the truth. Well, when you got one guy in the village who knows exactly what he's saying and he wants it to say it a certain way, what do you think it's going to say? He's going to preach it a certain way. So that's sort of interesting because, well, another historical point, if you remember back to your American history in high school, the Great Awakening, right? The Second Great Awakening, what causes that to happen? What causes the United States to all of a sudden be like, you know what, we're all interested in religion again? It's the increase in literacy rates. People are able to read the Bible for the first time, well, not for the first time, to read the Bible for themselves for the first time, and they start thinking, oh, wait a second, maybe this isn't right. Maybe we need to look into that. It's pretty interesting when you look at it historically. All this stuff has historical context, which adds to it. That's going to move us into the Wycliffe Bibles. Anybody heard of Wycliffe? Not the musician that was popular in the 90s. Like Greg's laughing because he knows. But the Wycliffe Bibles, I'm going to go forward one and then go back. It's this handsome gentleman. His name's John Wycliffe. He's a theologian in England. And he has a quote. Up until now, all the Bibles are in what, Greg? You said it earlier. All the Bibles are in the Greek. Nope. They switched from Greek. They're in Latin now. I just want to make sure you got the Latin in there. So they're in Latin now. Latin is not the language of even Italy, right? Italy at this point let me go back and look. In the 1300s, 1400s, Italy has moved into a version of Italian. But who speaks Latin still? The priests. What was it? I don't remember. But in they didn't start doing their masses in English or Spanish. It was at the 70s that they changed that, and there's still some churches where you can go to the Latin masses, which is interesting. But they didn't start doing this in the 1970s. And so back then, if we did this, and I would say I was the priest, I would be the only person that could read or speak Latin. And I would come in and say, we're going to read from Matthew chapter 1. And I'd start speaking Latin, and you guys are all going to do what? Go to sleep. You all are going to go, okay. You're going to do what we call agreeing with the preacher, where you start nodding and, because you don't speak it. You don't know it. And everything's going to be written in Latin. John Wycliffe says, his quote, I wrote this down because I thought it was a great quote. It helps Christian men to study the gospel in that tongue in which they know best. And this is in the 1300s that he says this. So for 1300 years, it's this revolutionary idea that this guy says, you know what? Let's translate the Bible into as many languages as we can. And actually, if you Google Wycliffe, the first thing that comes up there's a group of people now called the Wycliffe Bible Translation Society, and they are sort of the go-to on historical biblical translations. Just sort of interesting. You can look at their research and do a lot of stuff there. So he does this. Who is not a fan of this, though? The Roman Catholic Church, because they're going to lose what? Money, influence, power. They're going to lose quite a bit here, because when they are the holders, the keeper of those keys, they are the ones that can read and translate for you, you're out of luck, right? And so what happens is they're going to move in. First one's going to be translated into English with Wycliffe. I'm going to show you it here in a second, and you're going to be like, that ain't English. Well, it's their English. You all heard Curtis say the opening to Canterbury Tales in the Middle English. Yeah. It's going to look like gibberish to you here in a second. So Wycliffe is going to do this. I can't remember if he gets executed or not. I think they did, but no, they didn't. He dies, and they were so mad at him that about 10 years later, they unbury his bones, put his bones on a stand in a courtroom, in a church courtroom, have a trial, find him a heretic, burn his bones at the stake, and then rebury him. I'm pretty sure that was Wycliffe, but they did this a few times. The whole Inquisition stuff was really wacky. So each copy is going to take 6 months. It would cost 6 months' wages or more. 6 months' wages. Okay? And in England at this time, you're still living on what's called subsistence agriculture. Y'all remember back to your history. I'm going to throw a lot of history at you because that's what I do. Subsistence agriculture means that you are growing just enough to eat for you and your family, right? And so that would mean me and Aaron and Mallory and Alex and Davis are growing just enough. Now, if we happen to grow, to have an extra sheep or something, we would sell that, or we would store it for the winter, or we would keep it and use the wool for warmth and maybe sell that, and we make a little bit of money off that. But people they don't have the jobs like we do, where you're getting hourly or salary rates, and you're just getting money, and then you have to decide what to do. You're taking care of yourself with this. So when it says 6 months' wages or more, that's not how we would look at wages. That's a really well-off 6 months' wages, okay? How long would it take to copy the Bible? It would take a trained scribe. Now, this is a trained scribe, anywhere between 1 to 3 years to copy this, okay? 3 years for the more fancy ones. I'm going to show you what this was. And then 1 year if they were just doing it just text. And it's pretty complicated work. And it is mainly just the priest, and there are people that's their only job. They're not like a priest in the ministering sense. They're mainly just working just with text. Yeah.
Wycliffe spoke what language?
He would have spoken Middle English.
It was English.
It would have been. You wouldn't have recognized. You maybe would have picked out a thee or a thy, but he wouldn't have. It wouldn't have been anything you would have understood as English. Yeah, I don't remember when the split was, but he would have been a member of the English, at least the English branch of the Catholic Church, if not the Church of England. I don't remember when that started. Gary, I forgot your question back there. Sorry, brother. Did I pass it? Sorry. I'm used to with kids. Sometimes they'll ask questions, and so I'm like, do I ask? So there he is, sporting his fancy beard. So there we go. So why would it take a year? That's a page. And they do this is all by hand, okay? And so he's got this, and they're copying it out by hand, and they're doing all this stuff. Pretty fancy. You can tell that this is really well done. There's another one. So even less text there. Anybody recognize that as anything? I see A's, maybe an S. But they also have this weird thing where if you look, you can see there are some F's in there that are a little taller than other F's. That's an S. So some S's look like that and some F's don't. And that's one of the things I picked up in history class in college. But there we go. I mean, that's pretty fancy. Bunch of different colored ink. I looked for a plain version, but why do you think there are no plain versions left? They were used. Yeah, those were the everyday, those were their driving around Bibles, right? The ones that would have that. Plus, if you're wealthy, you're more likely to buy this as a status symbol and keep it nice and used. Whereas if you're a little country congregation or a country parish or whatever, you've got the one Bible, it's probably not going to be very expensive, and it's not going to be well made. It'll probably fall apart faster. So 1400s, we have multiple copies of this. After the codexes, what is the most important Bibles that we have? Not important Bibles, but the most historically and monetarily valuable ones are going to be the Gutenberg Bibles. Has anybody ever seen a Gutenberg Bible? Who's Johannes Gutenberg? What did he invent? Printing press, right? And so we have originals of what he printed. I believe there's 46 of them left. And you can go, if you look up Gutenberg Bible, it'll tell you exactly where all 46 of them are, whether they're privately held or publicly held. The Speed Museum, about once every 5 years, gets a Gutenberg Bible to put on display. The art museum at U of L. And they'll put it on display, and it's pretty neat. This time it was with Da Vinci, Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks. And they had the Gutenberg Bible. It was a history of printing art exhibit. And had a Gutenberg Bible, the Da Vinci stuff, and then some other really interesting books. But it's neat. How can you tell if you've got a Gutenberg Bible versus a handwritten Wycliffe copy? Look at the lines. You can see where the person wrote, they drew a line on it so they would keep their writing straight. You see that up there? Look at the top line. Right below what looks like an N, you can see the lines where they'll keep it straight. Now, if you ask me if you want to copy the left or the right, I'm going to pick the right because that left one, and you're using a quill and ink the whole time. So you got to be careful. If you can get to the bottom of that page and you pick it up to go to your ink quill and it drips, done. Start over, new page, or start that whole same page over. Oh, good. I'm going to go a little quicker here. Now we're at the point where we have everything on apps. Okay. How many of you all use electronic Bible copies? Quite a few of you. Super useful. I'm going to show you two of my favorite ones because, like I said, with Curtis, there's so many extra stories. I didn't know how much time I had, so I threw these in here. The first one I'll show you, if you have an Apple phone, or this is Apple or Android, is called the Blue Letter Bible, and sort of play on the Red Letter Bible, all that stuff. What it is a Bible, but it is also a concordance. It is also an interlinear, CG has it. It is an interlinear concordance, and then it is also interlinear text, sorry. And what it'll do is, so if you go, let's say we're reading Matthew 11. You tap on Matthew 11 and you say interlinear, and it will show you the exact Greek and the order in which it says it. And you can tell it, I want to see it in the English flow or the Greek flow, and it sort of shows you it's this word, this word, this word. But what you can do is you can click on, let's say John 3:16, God for God so loved the world, decent, right? And so you click on love, and it shows you which love it is, and then it shows you every other place in the Bible that it was used, and then it also shows you how it was translated also in context. So it's really cool to use. It helps me as a studier to see the flow of the language, because you get a little bit more of the impact of, you know what, this was what they're really focusing on here. Let me go back one. And then it has, I think it's ESV, comes with it automatically downloaded, and you can use that offline, but you can download all kinds of other stuff. The other one is called Logos Bible Study Tools. How many of you all had that on your computer? I remember my dad, we got him that for his birthday one year, was the Logos CDs, back when computers could still take CDs. And it was a big deal because it had all these extra concordances and stuff. Well, they put it in app form, and that's its logo if you go looking for it. That's its little icon. But what it does, it sort of does the same thing, but this is my favorite feature, and it's not a super scriptural study tool. It lets you drag a line between two kinds of scripture. So you can have an ESV open on the top of your screen, and you can have a concordance open on the bottom of your screen, and use both simultaneously, which is really cool because how many of you all have ever used the app? You have to okay, switch to this one. Nope, go back. And if you use the Bible app most people use, it resets itself, and you have to go find where you were. So this is really useful for studying and having different things. You can buy several concordances. You can buy several different sets of, commentaries. You can buy, I think Haley's is on there for free last time I looked. But you can do all kinds of stuff. It also does the word breakdown, which is what that little pie chart right there is. It's going to tell you how often that word gets said and where it's at and whether it's New Testament, Old Testament, and what kind of does. The last thing I wanted to tell you about is if you are a library patron, you have access to an app called Hoopla, which is you can download a bunch of free books and stuff. There are commentaries, there are concordances, there are a lot of religious things you can use there. And I'll throw the grain of salt, or take those with grains of salt. If you don't know, hey, is this a good commentary to use? Ask any of these guys around here. I'm sure they'll tell you. Stephen is really good. Brad would be a good person to ask about it. And they'll tell you. Next, on Wednesday, Curtis is going to start in on the timeline, and this is going to be the biggest chunk of what we're going to do, because we're going to go from Exodus all the way up to modern day, where we are with translations and research. We're going to get a lot more history. So thanks a lot, guys. It was a great class. I appreciate it.